So welcome back to the end of the year videos, and we do the best and worst, right? And we do most disappointing and most surprisingly good. This list is entirely subjective. It's completely based upon my opinion. You may have a different list, and that's okay. But this is my list. You also have to realize that I didn't buy many Transformers. I don't buy many Transformers in general anymore because I'm just waiting for kind of stuff to come out. So a lot of these will be figures that I didn't purchase. But we're going to do this video, and then like every other year, we're going to do the best non-transforming figures, and then we're going to do a best figures that I bought for 2024. So this is one video of 3 in typical fashion. Let's go ahead and get started. And we get started with the most disappointing figures of 2024. So, just a quick reminder on what disappointing means. It doesn't mean that these figures are bad. It just means that I had an expectation perhaps that they would be better, and they let me down in some way, shape, or form. So, starting off with number 5, most disappointing figure of the year, I have Unique Toys Dumber. Now, once again, this figure's not bad. In fact, it's far from it, and far superior than most toys that I look at all year. And while the transformation is sophisticated, it doesn't have the quite smooth polish of it that Unique Toys has been known to have, especially coming off of Dino earlier in the year, which was amazing. This one left me slightly disappointed because it just wasn't up to the same standard. Still a great figure, just let me down a bit. Number 4, Magic Square Swindle. Once again, not a bad figure, but coming off of the Brawl, so to speak, I thought it was going to be better. I think the Brawl lends itself to a more one-to-one cartoon translation, and I think the Legends class lend themselves in the same way. This one looks really plain and childish on my shelf. I also was hoping that they would learn a bit more of a lesson in dealing with the hip structure from Brawl, but because of how quickly this one came out afterwards, I'm guessing they did not. Either way, it left a lot to be desired from me. It's not a bad figure, just disappointing because I preferred Brawl so much more. Number 3, DX9's Double Dealer. With the kind of return and announcement of DX9, I was really excited about what they would have to offer, and while I don't think this figure was terrible by any stretch of the imagination, the Power Masters didn't work quite well. It had a lot of wonky joints, specifically the biceps, but also the feet and the hips were a little off, and the figure that I looked at was fully painted, and the fact that the head sculpt wasn't painted kind of like dried the figure out for me a little bit. I just wish that it was a bit more refined for like their triumphant return, you know? And while I don't think it was bad, it definitely left me a bit disappointed. Number 2, Fans Hobby Learn to make easier words to pronounce, am I right? This figure just had a couple issues. It wasn't a bad figure by any stretch of the imagination, but it did some things that I don't expect Fans Hobby to do. One of which was have like a transformation process that was frustrating, which I don't usually encounter with Fans Hobby. The sliders in particular on this figure were really poorly toleranced. So the process of manipulating the figure was kind of a bear, and that's just something that I don't expect with that company. It also had limited articulation, which is kind of hit or miss for Fans Hobby, but between the two, it made for a pretty disappointing experience. And number 1 for most disappointing figure of the year for me was X-Transbot's Runabout. The kind of color palette that was more like a chocolatey gray was an issue. The fact that they cut out that square in the chest to me was just unforgivable. Some of the transformation sequences specifically regarding the feet were a bit of a bear. I think because of the kind of return on your investment with this set, with getting 2 for the price of 1 in terms of producing it, I was expecting it to be a bit better. And while the other one, the Run Amok, doesn't really bother me, the square on the chest is just so unforgivable for me. It's such an easy thing to avoid, but they couldn't help but run headfirst into it. So that's my number 1. And, you know, there's a look at my top disappointing figures of the year. And like I said, none of them are bad. I don't think you'd be mad at yourself for buying any of these. I think that they're all pretty good figures. I just think that some of them are just standing on the shoulders of previous releases or expectations that leave a little bit to be desired at the end of the day. And that's why they make the list. Moving on to surprisingly good figures of the year, meaning figures that I didn't necessarily expect much out of, but they ended up being better than I expected. Now, in the same way that the disappointing doesn't make the figure awful, being surprisingly good doesn't make the figure great. It just makes it better than I expected. So let's go ahead and get into them. Number 5, Phantasmo Series Elite Leader. There's a lot of stiff competition, so to speak, out there regarding non-transformable figures. There's a lot of companies with a foot really heavy or heavily cemented in that game that make great figures. So when new companies come out that do it, I'm always kind of like, what could you possibly offer? But the paint alone on this figure was just so spectacular. One of the best painted figures that I've seen all year, that I was really kind of made to kind of take a step back and reevaluate my biases regarding this figure, or perhaps even my biases in a positive way regarding their competition, and give this figure more of a fair shake. Just an incredibly aesthetically pleasing figure. Number 4, Mech Invasion, Mixmaster, and Scrapper. Once again, I think because of my biases regarding the aesthetic cues that they chose and the reimagination of Devastator, I was kind of turned off to begin with. But the amount of fun that I had with this set and the amount of attention to detail that they put into it and making it a very smooth set of figures that are really fairly priced and accomplish all their goals insanely well, it was staggering and should be recognized, which puts them on the list for number 4 of most surprising good. Coming in at number 3 is Magic Square Brawl. This was Magic Square's kind of first endeavor in upscaling their Legends to Masterpiece, and there was a lot of kind of apprehension, I think specifically on my part, about how it would translate. And this one I think translates very well and works fairly well. A couple things that I hope to see them improve upon in the future, and I didn't see that with Swindle obviously, but a very, very, very powerful step in the right direction, to a point where I ended up keeping the one that I reviewed and just bought Scott M another one so he could have a fresh take, because I was so kind of surprised and taken back at how much I liked it. Number 2, MMC's Groove. This does everything that MMC does when MMC does it the best, to include an interesting, smooth transformation, tons of articulation, great character sculpt, etc., etc. But what made it surprisingly good was seeing a ton of paint on an MMC figure. The amount of paint that's on the front of the arms, the chest, the pelvis, and then enough accents down the legs to kind of get the legs by. I've been screaming this kind of from the top of the mountains for years, that MMC, if they were to paint their figures, it would put a whole new frame around the pieces that they do, and this one I think proves it. This is one of the ugliest Transformer designs in history, I think, and is one of the best looking renditions of it, and part of that is because of the amount of paint that they applied to it to make it pop, making it number 2 on my surprisingly good list. And then my number 1 is Studio Series 1986 Optimus Prime. I have a long and complicated history reviewing Hasbro products on this channel, and more often than not, I would color myself unimpressed. But this is a truly great figure. Now, it has a higher price point, and that's part of the reason why they were able to do what they did, but it doesn't change the fact that they did it. This is a piece where the love, passion, dedication, and understanding of how important it was to get it right all come through in a way that Hasbro rarely does, but has been getting progressively better at, specifically over this past year and a half. A great undertaking with an incredible follow-through, making it the most surprisingly good figure of the year for me, in part just because of the company that made it. And there they are. That's my top 5 most surprisingly good figures of the year. And I think that all of them have had a moment with me. All of them have like kind of made me turn my head, take notice in a way that either, once again, that their predecessors haven't, or that my expectations were somewhat jaded. But I've become a believer in all 5 of these and the companies that make them as well. So there you go. Which brings us to the worst figures of the year. Some people's favorite part, and sometimes they're the most fun. And we'll start off with number 5. TMT Cyberbee. A company that took on like a Cybertronian Bumblebee from the movie, I think, aesthetic. And let me tell you something, this thing is a mess. Limited articulation for a Masterpiece figure, 90-degree elbows, 90-degree knees. But we see that with Fans Toy stuff a lot. We see that with Fans Hobby, you know, just in a previous figure. So that's not enough. But it also has no waist swivel. Once again, we've seen that with other Masterpieces. But on top of that, it has tolerance issues. Some joints are too loose, some are too tight. It has paint, but the paint is sloppy. The transformation is awful, and the whole figure makes a ton of sacrifices in order to pull off the transformation, and then the transformation ends up being a nightmare. So all the sacrifices end up being for nothing, which makes this figure number 5 on my worst figure of the year list. Number 4, Mechanical Alliance Sonic Warrior. Once again, this is a complete nightmare of a figure. The joints are horrible. In fact, so bad that they can't even support the guns, and they can barely support the arms themselves. Most of the times, the arms are going to have to be down by the waist because the joints just aren't strong enough at the shoulder. I don't think there's a ratchet in the thing to hold the amount of weight up, so the opportunities of what you can actually do with it are not much. Then the build of it is poorly done. It feels cheap. It feels junky. And then there's other things like the instructions are awful and stuff like that, but it's just the overall product is just not up to par in today's market. Number 3, Takara Tomi's Brave Commander. A horrible figure of a great character in a great movie. And I expected more out of Takara, being as though Takara has the reputation they have. But this thing is junky. Not enough paint. The plastic feels cheap. It feels empty. It feels hollow. It feels like a shell. It doesn't have that, like, just wait for the Takara version presence that I expect from Takara. And in fact, feels way worse than what Hasbro's producing on a regular basis. Which is why it ends up on the worst list. It's one of those, like, look how far the mighty have fallen. A true letdown of a figure and a wasted opportunity. My number 2 is Wonderful Trans City Atlas. Their take on Prime. I think, first of all, the fact that the kind of whole design was lifted from Flames toys just never sat right with me. And maybe that would have been okay if they made everything else right, but I can assure you that everything else is indeed not right. Panels and pieces of it don't sit flush with one another, probably because they were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, so to speak. And then it just has one of the most awful transformation experiences of the year. Frustrating, not intuitive in any way, shape, or form, and then on top of that, the aesthetic isn't even original, so it's just too much of a bad thing in one little container. And then number 1, I don't think this should come to anyone as any surprise, Takara's Raiden. An effort that went out of its way to show how little the term masterpiece could possibly mean. Everything is almost wrong about it. The scale is wrong. The aesthetic is wrong. They cared about one thing, which was the train mode, and that's arguably the thing that nobody else did care about, which is a true shame, because that brand used to mean something, that name used to mean something, and the truth is it means something now, but it's not what they would like it to mean. And in some ways, people are going to see this as one of the last masterpiece offerings, and imagine the taste that it will leave in your mouth, so to speak. Awful, awful figure. And there they are, my 5 worst figures of the year, and I would challenge you to pick something worse, because these are really rough ones, and I've looked at some rough stuff this year, but these definitely take the cake. All fairly pricey for what they are, and ultimately not worth a red penny, making them the 5 worst figures of the year for me. But let's move on to a brighter subject. Top 5 figures of the year, the best of the best. And we'll start with number 5. Mechanical Skull Studios Sirius. A Legends figure that blew me out of the water. I have a certain amount of expectations these days after dealing with Iron Factory and New Age and Magic Square and companies that have kind of really defined what it means to work in the Legends space. And here comes this company out of nowhere with one of the best offerings that I've seen all year, period. Let alone in the Legends space. Paint, accessories, tons of articulation, more than most masterpieces. Just an absolute knockout of a figure, earning it on the top 5 list, which may be one of the few times a Legends figure has gotten on the top 5 list. Number 4, MMC Hotspot. Just a big brawler of a figure that many of us have waited for a proper masterpiece rendition for some time, and this one did not let me down. Not only is the sculpt great, and he's such an intimidating presence on the shelf, but the transformation to get to all 3 modes is so bloody fascinating. Just an absolute knockout of a figure with attention to detail paid throughout, built like a brick. I would feel comfortable throwing this thing across the room and know that it wouldn't break. Don't advise anyone take the chance, but I would feel comfortable. It's just a really, really, really well-made figure. Doesn't have a lot of the glitz and glam that I wish it did, to rewind back to that groove conversation, but imagine if it did, it would probably be number 1 on my list. But as a result, it sits at a firm number 4. Number 3, Unique Toys Dino. We start getting into the top 3 figures of the year, and it just kind of ends up becoming a bit repetitive. Outstanding sculpt in terms of trying to nail what it was trying to nail. I don't think much of it, but I understand what they were trying to do, right? Outstanding paint, top to bottom. Great alt mode, appropriate accessories. An absolutely breathtaking transformation that still has left me breathless in some ways. I do a lot of this stuff throughout the year, and having something really like make me take a step back and reevaluate how I see how companies should be engineering their figures, it's got to be something special, and this indeed is that, earning it number 3 in my top 5 figures of the year. Number 2, Fans Toy Scourge. Just one of those instances where Fans Toys does what Fans Toys does best, and that is staying true to themselves while still embodying the elements of the character. This has those cartoon elements, it has those iconic pieces that definitely make you reminisce of the G1 cartoon, but it's not a one-to-one translation of that cartoon. It's Fans Toys' approach to that cartoon in a more cartoon-inspired way than they started, but definitely less one-for-one than a lot of stuff they do today. And as a result, it's a callback and almost nostalgic for me to look at this piece that reminds me of what I truly love about Fans Toys when they do this. And this figure's a great representation of it. And my number one figure of the year is X-Transbots Long Haul. When this figure came out, I was like, this might end up being him. It might end up being my number one. And it did. I love the paint scheme, metallic colors throughout, pop on a shelf. The transformation was not as much a nightmare as I expected it to be. In fact, I didn't have much of a problem with it at all. And if I didn't, that's certainly saying something. The articulation is out the wazoo. And most importantly, what I love about this figure is they took a character that has historically always looked stupid and made him look cool and made him look intimidating. And I, for one, appreciate it. I don't really have a whole lot of negative to offer on this guy. I think this is a knockout figure, and he's my figure of the year. And there they are, my top 5 figures of the year. Well, top 5 Transformers of the year anyway. And they're all really well done, really well painted, really well sculpted, tons of articulation, cool transformations, great alt modes, etc., etc. Like, they just do what you're supposed to do. And they do it exceptionally well. And I'm happy that there's some surprising companies on there like Unique Toys and Mechanical Skull Studios. So congratulations to the winners. And there's a little group shot of the kind of greatest hits for the sake of doing it. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'm sure there will be talks about Superion. I don't think Superion is a bad figure by any stretch of the imagination. I just don't think it's a greater figure than my top 5. I think Superion is a very good combiner. But that's why it didn't make my greatest list. But it didn't make any worse or disappointing lists either. But these are, it's interesting because I don't know if I bought many other masterpieces this year in general. So I guess I bought a couple other fans toys. But, 2 MMCs and the positives, 2 Magic Squares, fans toys, 2 X-Transbots, It's interesting. I always think it's interesting to look at stuff like that in terms of what I bought and how I view it in terms of the echelon of the year. So I hope that helps. I will be back at some point. I think it's either this week or next week with my top 5 non-Transformer figures of the year, and then we'll go from there. Hope that helps. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.